welcome back, everyone. Studio is in a celebratory mood this morning. I guess they're preparing us for the long weekend. We must not forget that. And let me just say, be careful this weekend. We want you right back here on Tuesday. All right? So we are going to be continuing our discussion on the upcoming budget this morning. We do have with us today Ozzi Warwick, General Secretary of Jtum'S. And we also have Trevor Johnson, Assistant General Secretary of the Joint Trade Union Movement, Jtum'S. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Yes, thank you for having us, Marlan. Yes.
Mr. Johnson, let's begin with you as we look forward to the Finance Minister's presentation on October 2nd. Does Jtum'S have any concerns? Is there anything that Jtum'S would like to see in the Finance Minister's presentation?
Certainly, Marlan, and thanks again for having us. And yes, the labor movement is certainly looking at the budget from a national perspective. Of course, our key interest would be issues that impact workers and how they're able to have a sustainable livelihood during the next upcoming period. So we're looking at the whole aspect of three planks, which I think Ozzi, my colleague Ozzi, will get into in more detail. But I want to remind you that since Labor Day 2023, we would have begun to send some signals to the government on some key aspects that would need attention. One of them at the time would have been the whole aspect of the minimum wage, and I think we have had discussions on that prior, because it's very important, Marlan, for us to put this in the context of a living wage. And from all that I've seen, the comments and commentary I've seen, economists, etc., I think everybody agrees that there must be a shift and an increase in the minimum wage to make it what we would constitute to be a living wage, because the people at the workers at the lower end of the income bracket, they certainly need to have an increase, and we had advocated for an increase of 30%, because minimum wage workers at present earn $140 a day to $700 a week. Simply is not sustainable. We had also spoken then on Labor Day about the whole aspect of the retirement age, because we think we see government put a push towards the retirement age, a longer retirement age. But that is something that concerns us, and from the feedback we have been getting concerns the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago. The majority of persons would want to retain their option to be able to retire at age 60 and be able to engage, some other aspect of their lives. So that is something that we would have raised. The issue of fuel prices, we believe that there has to be a reconciliation between because we saw a significant drop at one point in fuel prices, but there was no attendant or corresponding adjustment at the pump in Trinidad and Tobago. And if we're talking about the liberalization of fuel prices, then we believe that the government has to look at that in terms of bringing some relief to the citizenry. I could mention here as well, of course, we know that outstanding negotiations is always an issue facing the labor movement. And whilst we have seen, I would say, some enforced settlements through the special tribunal at the Industrial Court of 4%, I want to say simply that we cannot have a one-size-fit-all approach to collective bargaining and negotiations in Trinidad and Tobago. There are different categories of workers, there are different skill sets. There are unions that have had and engaged in job evaluation and market surveys. And to bring a sort of like a one-size-fits-all is not going to cut it. Yes. And quickly to end this input here, we really need workers. Even with those settlements, workers have been brought up to 2019, and not all of them, mind you. So which means that there's still, this is pre-COVID pandemic, mind you, 2019. So we're still talking a 3 to 4 year gap between the income of worker, the average worker in Trinidad and Tobago, and 2023, where we are now. So those are some immediate concerns we would like to put on the table that we expect the government to address and give serious consideration to in its 2023-2024 budget.
Yeah. Ozzi, what are some of the other issues that you think that the government must consider?
Yes, thanks a lot, Marlan. Always good to be on a program with you and, of course, with my fellow comrade Trevor Johnson. Marlan, allow me to just say something about the budget.
Yes.
Contrary to how you and I may look, I think we are more or less the same age, okay? And I think you would be very well aware, since you were a young boy, like myself, the budget always is a big national event. It's always, something that our parents would huddle around the radio, or, well, in those days, it didn't really have live streaming, but really the radio.
Yes.
And just to hear what is going to happen, there's always this level of anxiety. Nobody is sure. People have a fear that, it's going to affect their daily life and so on. And that is a problem, Marlan, because it means that our national budget is disconnected from some medium or long-term vision for the future of Trinidad and Tobago. And the second thing is the process itself. The process is not democratic. And I just want to say that from the trade union movement point of view, we have always advocated for participatory budgeting. So those are two sort of general points that I wanted to make about our budget, that it's disconnected from a medium and a long-term vision for where the country needs to go. And secondly, that the process itself is undemocratic. Now, having said that, I want to put what Comrade Johnson said into context. He talked about our 3 pillars. From the trade union movement, our 3 pillars is mitigation, stabilization, and transition. And the Labor Day demands, because sometimes our bourgeois economists and commentators tend to be dismissive of labor's demands, but those demands fit within certain economic categories. So, for example, increasing the minimum wage is really part of economic sustainability, where you have an increased disposable income for employed people and therefore will contribute to increasing demand. And if you increase the demand side, then you can have more economic activity. The question of not increasing the retirement age, our proposal was, listen, you need to improve revenue collection. Those employers who are taking monies from the workers but not remitting it to the NIB. When we talk about reducing fuel costs and motor property tax, that is in the context of economic mitigation. How can we reduce the cost of living generally in Trinidad and Tobago? So I think it is important for us to suggest that labor's demands do fit within certain economic categories, which speaks to economic sustainability and economic mitigation.
Yeah. But Mr. Johnson, just touching and jumping off of Ozzi's point there, since the trade union movement would have made these demands, there was also a concern, how is government going to afford this? Of course, the argument has been, well, we're just coming out of the pandemic, and we're finally seeing things improving economically. There has been a call for patience from the trade union movement and other organizations. So again, how is the government going to afford what the trade union movement has been calling for?
Well, I just want to remind Marlan that, of course, it's not just demands or recommendations being made by the trade union movement. We also have significant recommendations from the business sector,
of course,
some of which is calling for relief in various areas. So we just need to put that in context. It's not just workers that are making these demands or recommendations. And the government itself would have signaled recently, and that there has been improved economic activity for this country. I think we're looking at something like a 3% growth in GDP over the next year or so that we are seeing some improvements. The Minister of Finance has indicated from time to time that there is positivity, if I can use that phrase, so that we expect that the government is going to, how should I put it, marshal that whatever increased revenue, etc., into some of these areas. I know we have a lot of capital expenditure, etc., to deal with, but the government, we believe, has to look at what revenue flows that it is getting and to be able to make the appropriate allocations accordingly, which is why my colleague, Comrade Ozzi, would have spoken about the whole process of the democratization of the process, because if you have constructive dialogue with the labor movement, with the business sector, before the budget, then certainly it will enable us to have constructive input and recommendations into the process. And quickly, the other thing I want to mention, because it's in the recommendations that we have sent or sending to the government, to the Minister of Finance, the whole issue of wastage. There are still many streams, Marlon, of revenue collection. We have seen just recently, I think it was indicated of a particular segment of government spending X million a year in rent for a property that it has not occupied. And how many times we hear the Auditor General in his report speak to millions and sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in wastage. And this is something that the government year in, year out has been promising to address, and it has not been able to address. So we are challenging the government that it has to make a serious effort on the issue where there's wastage, where there's overlap of expenditures. We are certain that these are areas that the government can address in order to manage its flow of revenue and be able to allocate a decent increase, not just to the minimum wage workers of Trinidad and Tobago, but also in all the areas within the public sector and state sector where workers are operating still on 2016, 2017, 2018 salaries, but are being expected to meet 2023 prices, which in most cases, when you hear prices increase, it's like 10, 20, 30% that workers are expected to meet that gap. So that this is something that we are serious about. The government needs to be able to meet that gap by increasing its efficiency in many areas.
Yeah. Yes, Ozzi.
Allow me to elaborate, all right, because I think your question is actually a really good question and ties into my earlier point about this absence of a medium and long-term vision for the future of Trinidad and Tobago. Because it's more than simply how will the government pay for this. It's how do we grow our economy in a way that is sustainable. Now, I want to put back on the table Labour's Economic Alternative Plan. It is a plan that we developed in 2016. It was rejected, and it continues to be rejected year after year. But let me just remind Trinidad and Tobago what that is and the vision of that. It has three parts: a fiscal policy, a monetary policy, and a social policy. In terms of the fiscal policy, we are suggesting that you use 3% of GDP for public investment. And here are the areas: agriculture. So imagine expanding, excuse me, expanding our food sovereignty and food security, investment in infrastructure in terms of roads so that we can increase productivity, expanding energy products, Marlan. We still this kind of extractivist type of economy, plantation economy, where we are simply producing raw material and exporting it. We are suggesting, no, there's so many different byproducts, energy products that we can look at, and that will require innovation, investment in technology, research and development, and then special projects in manufacturing and tourism, for example, and even maritime because of our location. in terms of the monetary policy, and this is where our recommendation is really interesting, the idea is to create an industrial development fund. Because, Marlan, you realize that we don't have an industrial policy. So we close a steel plant, we close a refinery, we have petrochemical plants closing, we have manufacturing closing and leaving, like, for example, Unilever.
Yes.
But nobody has an idea, okay, what is the future industries for Trinidad and Tobago? And the labor movement is saying, create an industrial development fund. Now, and of course, to tie into your question, well, how will we fund it? Listen, we can capitalize the fund, Marlan, by just using local sources, like, for example, the credit union movement, which has a huge asset base of 10 billion, NIB with an asset base of 27 billion, local banks with their excess liquidity, and they always declaring hundreds of millions of dollars in profits. Well, reinvest it in an industrial development fund that will help finance an industrial policy whereby the country itself as a whole is investing in future industries that will, in effect, grow a sustainable economy.
Ozzi, it would be remiss if I didn't ask this question as we move into this budget season here. Is the trade union movement, more so the OWTU, Jtum'S, are they still interested in the refinery?
The fact is, Marlan, that a lot of our foreign exchange problems stems from the fact that they closed the refinery. We warned in 2018 that will happen, and we continue to warn every year. We believe that having this asset sitting there idle, becoming almost scrap iron, is such a disgrace to our national heritage. Imagine, after we boast of 110 years of refining, we have basically scrap iron in Point-a-Pierre. The trade union movement continues to advocate for the restart of the refinery. There is still an interest in it. And I think even as we go through a process of energy transition, because you still have to finance the transition, and that is a way in which we could have financed the transition. So we continue to demand that refinery be restarted, and that the workers and the communities that have been so negatively affected can see some semblance of hope again. Because that is what is happening in Trinidad and Tobago, a lack of hope. When I heard you this morning, I could not believe, because I have not seen the papers, but I could not believe what you read. Marlan, this is Trinidad and Tobago. This is what we have become. And why have we become this way? People want to blame everybody else. It's because there's a lack of political leadership that says to the country, listen, this is the future. There is hope in that future. We can build a Trinidad and Tobago where people can have a decent standard of living. You know what has happened? People have moved from decent jobs with good terms and conditions to precarious work, where you're hustling. People who are a stable job now have to hustle to put food on the table, Marlan.
Yes.
I think Labour, I'm saying here this morning, Marlan, Labour is presenting a vision. We are not just making demands. We are saying that our Labor Day demands fit within certain economic categories in terms of the mitigation, transition, sustainability. We are saying that Labour's economic alternative plan has built in it, very importantly, the development of an industrial policy with just transition built inside of it to be funded by an industrial development fund using the asset base of local sources.
Yeah. All right, gentlemen, we have really run out of time, but Mr. Johnson, I'm going to give you 1 minute for your final comments.
Certainly. Thanks, Marlan. As my colleague Ozzi would have indicated, we just want to indicate Labour is not just here making demands. We are still participating. Up to the last week, in the last week, we have been participating in consultations held by the Ministry of Labour on HIV policy in the workplace, on child labor, etc., so that our context is not just a matter of making demands for increased wages. What we are looking for is sustainability, as my colleague Ozzi would have looked at. I mean, increased productivity for the nation, and of course that's a discussion for not this morning.
Yes.
But Labour is basically signaling to the government of Trinidad and Tobago that you need to pay attention to the citizenry, to the working people of Trinidad and Tobago, to the retired persons of Trinidad and Tobago, how they live, to business, but you need small business and micro enterprises in particular. We expect and hope that the budget will bring a vision and bring clarity in terms of moving our economy forward into a level of sustainability and bringing hope, again, as was echoed by my colleague, bringing hope to the citizenry of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marlan.
Yeah, gentlemen, it's always a pleasure having a discussion with members of the trade union movement. So thank you very much for that opportunity this morning.
Thank you, Marlan, for having us.
All right, bye for now. So it's time for a quick break. We are coming back.